Fred Morgan and his wife Ann gave birth to my mother in 1913. It was during a snowstorm in Grass Valley. It was in January. The doctor was on his way on the trolley car, which ran between Grass Valley and Nevada City. The trolley got stuck in the heavy snow on Main Street Hill. My family at that time lived up on Linden Avenue, and the doctor had to walk up Main Street to get to the home. By that time, my grandmother had given birth to my mother, Jean Morgan Simmons.
I think it was my mother's grandparents ran the streetcar for a period of time, and it ran out East Main Street and down into the Brunswick Basin, and the turnaround spot was right in that intersection where B&C Lumber and the Yuba Professional Building is. My mom's mom and dad always went to Lake Olympia, as my mom did as a young girl too, back in those days, and they'd ride the trolley out and get off there and had to walk in then to Lake Olympia, which probably was a good half mile at least, I guess, in there off of that. And so they'd go out there and go dancing every Wednesday and Saturday night. So
Broad Street used to freeze over in the winter, and they also get at the very top of Broad Street and sled or skate all the way down to the bottom on the ice. There was that much ice formed. They also used to have ice cream socials in the summer, and they used to go on the trolley between Grass Valley and Nevada City to visit their friends.
And that was, by the way, was put in by the two guys that started PG&E, DeSabla and Martin. The trolley car was electrified, and they were really into power. Every mine had a water pipe coming in and would run a Pelton wheel. Like the Empire mine, they had two huge Pelton wheels that ran the hoist. They had another Pelton wheel that ran the machine shop. And then it was very shortly after that electricity came in, and they turned right around and used the Pelton wheels to run the generators.
Pacific Gas Electric Company wasn't always PG&E. It was a gas company, and it became an electrical company, and then they combined to become PG&E Corporation.
For a long time, each mine kind of made his own electricity, and then a guy, Glasson, I believe his name was, put in a power plant on Deer Creek. Well, more people started using electricity, and it couldn't handle it. So then they built the Rome powerhouse, right out of Nevada City.
In the foothills of Nevada County, they found that it was ideal for hydroelectric power plants because of the steep gradient of the water and the way that it was carried here by the flumes.
They actually ran wires clear to the Bay Area. If you can imagine running a wire from here to the Bay Area. Of course, they needed the system that was already there to sell their product. And of course, at that time in San Francisco, there was a lot of systems. They were all over San Francisco run by coal. But it wasn't really efficient because they were always cutting each other's throat, and one pipe ran alongside the other, cutting their rates. And they just decided, there's only one way to do this, one company.
We're standing here at the main entrance of the Nevada County Narrow Gauge Depot, and this was the hub of transportation in Nevada County. Grass Valley and Nevada City never experienced a depression because of the prosperity of the gold mines, and so as a result you had lots of prominent citizens, mining engineers, entrepreneurs of all kinds entering these steps to go between Nevada City and the Transcontinental Railroad at Colfax. It was really a happening place.
1874, they did charter the Nevada County Narrow Gauge Railroad to be built from Colfax to Grass Valley and then to Nevada City. If you were hauling equipment from Auburn to Grass Valley during the winter via wagon, depending on the weather, it could take you maybe up to 3 days to get it here, because of the mud.
John Kidder was hired by the Coleman brothers, who owned mines here in town, to build the railroad. This was after the main railroad was put in. The Central Pacific, went over and met with the Union Pacific. And so at Colfax, they built a station there, and the narrow gauge railroad started there. And all the mines were very important at this time, and it came like between the Brunswick mine and the Union Hill mine, and then came over Cedar Crest and came on in Bennett Street, wound in Bennett Street, and got to Grass Valley and the main station there, and then went on down the creek, Wolf Creek, and went right on out to the Idaho-Maryland mine. Well, the Idaho-Maryland mine was owned by the Coleman brothers.
Kidder was a surveyor and had surveyed many railroads. He began buying up a lot of the railroad stock, and eventually had enough stock to become president of the railroad itself. And he ran and operated the railroad until, I would say, about 1899, and whereas he became ill and passed away. His wife, Sarah Kidder, took control of the railroad and operated it very successfully until 1913.
Well, we're here at the site of the famous Kidder Mansion. This was not only the hub of the railroad operations from 1876 to 1912, but also the hub of Grass Valley in general. This was the first modern mansion built in Grass Valley. John F. Kidder already being extremely accomplished by the time he came to Grass Valley. He had been a surveyor, a state assemblyman for California. He had engineered construction on numerous railroads before coming to Grass Valley in 1875 to oversee the construction of the Nevada County narrow gauge.
The benefit for using narrow gauge in this area is because of the tight, windy terrain. It's a lot cheaper to make the cuts, and this was a tremendous amount of work that needed to be done to build this road, cutting through the foothills and over rivers. A lot of bridges and tunnels had to be built, and so it was a big job, but it was done in 2 years.
Well, where the dam is, when you look to the left, you see the dam for Rawlins Lake. Just this side of that was where this big wooden bridge was constructed back in like 1885, so the railroad could cross and hook up in Colfax. Of course, the railroad closed in 1940 with World War II, and they needed the lumber, the metal, and everything else. So the bridge was still there until 1965, 68. And that's when they were going to put the dam up and create Rawlins Lake. And it was going to be a big party. Everybody was invited out to watch the demolition. Dynamite at the bottom and halfway up and halfway out. This is a tall bridge. It was as tall and as high in the air as the top of the dam is now. They went out there, thousands of people gathered to watch this thing, and they 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, pushed the plunger, and the thing went settled back down. It couldn't even blow it up. It was so well built.
Sarah Kidder actually, during her tenure as president of the railroad, provided returns and dividends on the stocks being held by individuals, whereas before, when John was operating the railroad, most of it just stayed within the company. So anyway, she also modernized the railroad in 1906. By 1906, most of the locomotives, save Nevada County Engine No. 1, had already been converted from wood to oil.
right alongside Red Mountain, just, I don't know, maybe 1,000 feet downhill from it, there's what looks like a concrete pillbox that's built on the side of the hill. That was built back in the 1870s by the railroad. Because if they have a wildfire anywhere in that area, it is going to destroy tens of thousands of acres possibly, which they needed, because this is where they found the wood to be able to throw in the boilers on the trains. These were all steam power trains. We didn't have electric trains. We didn't have diesel trains. They didn't ever use gasoline, at least not around here, but they did use steam, and there was only one way to fire that steam up, and that's to burn the wood. So they'd harvest this stuff. So they built this lookout so they could, muster up a fire crew in the event that they saw smoke. And I've been up there so many times. You can see for miles to the west and miles to the, almost all the way to Donner Summit.
What had happened, in mining around 1880 is they ran out of wood. Everybody was heating with wood, building with wood, cooking with wood. The mines used huge amounts of wood for timbering and building their buildings, and they just ran out of wood.
We look around now and there's trees everywhere, but if you look at photographs, it was pretty much denuded. The timber being used for the mining efforts and building homes. Along the Nevada County narrow gauge right of way, they used the wood for fuel. It came to a point where they had to convert over to oil as a primary source of fuel.
For a long time, the Kidder Mansion sat at the corner of Bennett and I guess 49 now. And it was a derelict. It was a destroyed house, but its majesty was still evident when you drove by. It was a beautiful Victorian house. I think she passed away in 1915 or 16, and it became a boarding house and a halfway house, and pretty soon it was just vagrants were living in it, and there really wasn't any way of fixing it. So it was still magnificent, but it was too sad that it just had to go. I have somewhere in my possession, I took probably a piece of wallpaper. It was leather, pressed, embossed leather on the walls. Think about the cost of wallpaper that's leather. And I'm talking wherever there's a flower on that wallpaper was embossed. I mean, it was three-dimensional. I mean, it's classic, the golden era, we got more money than we need and we're going to show it off type situations. And it was a beautiful home. I would have loved to have seen it in its heyday.
The Nevada County narrow gauge hauled a lot of gold out of Nevada County, and then it was transferred in Colfax and then down to San Francisco.
The hydraulic miners were extremely filthy rich in a short period of time. It's the cheapest way to extract gold, hence they were Kidder's biggest clients. They were spending lots of money with him to transport their gold over to Colfax.
And of course, in the late 1800s, hydraulic mining was banned, by the Supreme Court, thank goodness, because it was just silting in all the rivers and delta and everything. It was just not a very good way to extract gold. It was not efficient, and it was just so polluting.
1884, Judge Sawyer ruled that hydraulic mining had to cease. It was destroying the environment. So when Sawyer handed down his decision, the miners had to be physically served by federal agents. And the rumor was that Kidder had a secret compartment in his house in which he hid them. So if you can't be served, don't have to turn off your hose.
It was called the Sawyer decision, and it was a very important decision that put more focus back on the hard rock mines in Grass Valley and Nevada City and really curbed all the hydraulic mining.
Finally, this Kidder Mansion was being torn down. Somebody had bought it and they were going to build apartments there. But I got a chance to go, while they were dismantling it, to go up and take pictures and that kind of stuff for the paper. And I'll be darned if they hadn't taken off the third floor and they were down to the kitchen, and right below where the kitchen table would have been was a chasm that was probably 3 feet deep. It was about 4 feet wide and 8 feet, where obviously somebody could have hid under that floor. And I'm convinced that's where they were hiding. That's my story. I love that story, and I want to stick to it.
It was a flourishing mine for a while. The Alpha and the Omega diggings are still visible. When you're traveling Highway 20, there's a rest stop that state put in a number of years back, and the Landmarks Commission put a landmark marker up there and shows where the diggings were. And if you stand on the edge of the parking lot of that rest stop, you can look down in and you can see this massive area that was hydraulic out.
Marysville, which is basically 16 feet below the ground level. Most of what Marysville is today is wash out of the mountains from the hydraulic mining.
Moore's Flat is is dead north of Nevada City. If you take Tyler Foot Road and you head out toward Graniteville, it's pretty close to Graniteville. All the topsoil was taken away with the hydraulic mining, and the level of the town went down. They moved the town 3 times, which meant that all the buildings had to be taken down, which they did in those days. They just took down the clapboard, put it on the back of a cart, and rolled it away.
Moore's Flat was a small little town, but it, once again, was like a lot of the mining towns. They flourished for a while, and as soon as the gold ran out, it was gone. It was a complete town with streets and buildings. There was hotels, there was bars, there were haberdasheries, clothing stores, general clothing, or general stores, and just a number of different things.
Well, Moore's Flat is a place that most people have not heard of. You know, people have heard that there was a town called Red Dog and there was a town called You Bet, but most people have not heard of Moore's Flat.
But there's a funny little twist to Moore's Flat. They had people that lived there, and they also had people that died there. Well, when they buried these people, they found a few years later, I think it was 1858, that there was gold under the coffins that they buried there. So they exhumed 145 bodies and moved the cemetery to a new location, and then they mined out the tertiary riverbed that was in there. They gave them the gold, and as soon as the gold was gone, everybody was gone.
There's so many different areas that are called flats, and that's because they would settle along creek fronts, and of course they would, if it wasn't flat, they would create a flat area so they could build their homes. In 1875, there were 2,500 people living in Scott's Flat. I've been asked many times, well, who was Scott? And I said, no. It was Scottish people. Scott's Flat was named after Scots that moved there and settled. They were miners.
Now Blue Tent is just a road. But at that time, Blue Tent developed very quickly as a little town. And it's called Blue Tent, according to what I've been told, because Levi Strauss put up the first tent there, and it was blue. And so they called it Blue Tent. So anyway, pretty soon there were a lot of other tents, little cabins and tents, and there was the old Blue Tent School where my great-grandfather went to school.
Timbuktu was the outgrowth of Rose's Bar, which was the little mining bar on the Yuba River. Things started to grow and they kind of came uphill a little bit. Timbuktu turned into a real bustling little town.
Timbuktu was kind of a little out-of-the-way place. Knew they had the telegraph line going through.
It had many bars and several bakeries. It had a theater, hotels, telegraph office. So, you know, it was kind of the business center of the mining communities there.
Timbuktu had its, I guess, some kind of a power line transmission or a telegraph line, or it had its claim to fame.
Oh, well, there's a couple of stories about how it got its name. One was that someone, when they came there, saw a couple of African-American men mining in the ravine, and they said, oh, look, we must be in Timbuktu, because Timbuktu is, of course, the famous gold city in Africa. But the other story is that a gentleman was prospecting up in the ravine, which now is called Timbuktu Ravine, And as he came back down the hill into Rose's Bar, the storekeeper there said, "Oh, look, here comes the Sultan of Timbuktu," meaning, he was making his riches up there. And so those are the two stories. I kind of tend to go with the one about the African American miners because we actually see them on the census.
People were arriving on ships from all over the world, and these ships, I read an estimate one time where there was something like 100 ships anchored in San Francisco Bay. And the crews, they would just abandon their ships and head for the gold fields. And the streams, were just shoulder to shoulder. I think something like 5,000 people living in Red Dog, and you bet if you can imagine that. 5,000 people out there, where would they sleep? Well, they slept everywhere,
Very well-trained, highly educated engineers from all over the world were drawn here because engineering was a critical part of mining, railroading, and everything else. And that really set us apart as far as the level of education and schooling and everything else that was part of this community.
My great-grandfather was at one point a manager, and as I understand it, a small part owner of the Empire Mine. There's various stories on how he lost that interest, but he did. He was a mining engineer, and the stories are written up in the history books where he was sent to Canada to do consulting as well as South America.
There was a guy named George Starr that was the cousin of William Bourne. He didn't have any particular occupation, and William asked him if he would like to work up at the mine, and it was his niche in life. And before you know it, he knew all about mining, and in fact, in about 6 years, he was the shift superintendent. And then about 1893, he met up with another man named John Hayes Hammond, who was a world-renowned a mining engineer, and they went to Africa. And he talked about, if I was here in Grass Valley, he said, I would probably have 200 miners working for me, but over there doing the same thing, I would use 2,000 miners because they were doing a lot by hand. You've probably seen movies where they're bringing things out of the holes with baskets, handing them to each other. It was a whole new ball game.
We think of the mines as being predominantly people working there from Cornwall and that sort of thing. But by the turn of the 20th century, the amalgam of different nationalities that were pouring into this country. Most of the people migrating for Europe spoke a single language. And so they would matriculate to places where they were understood, their culture was supported.
Because there were so many people pouring in from all over the world, to mine in California, and especially this area. So it's not unusual to look around and figure out, oh, there's all these different nationalities and people. And when they moved, they wanted to stay together. The Scottish people wanted to group together because they knew each other and they knew what their capabilities were.
My wife's grandma Nellie, she was born in Italy, 3 when she moved here. Her parents bought and ran the Italian Hotel, which essentially in those days was a boarding house for all of the miners, particularly the ones from Europe that came across in the early part of the century and migrated west in search of gold and that kind of work. And I understand through another close friend of mine, Chris Entz, that it was a lot more than just a boarding house for Italian miners, which is the way my family recognizes it.
There is a restaurant in Grass Valley called the South Pine Cafe. And the South Pine Cafe has a great deal of history associated with it. It used to be called the Golden Heart Hotel. And it was a place for miners to come and stay. And the third story of the Golden Heart Hotel was a place where all the miners had little rooms. Now, before it was sold to be the South Pine Cafe, the people that owned it were very frightened by the disturbances that took place there. They believed that the whole third story was haunted. There were 3 murders that occurred up there of 2 soiled doves, and one was a miner. And when I was there doing the research on it, the people were so bothered by the disturbances of the 3rd floor that they had boxes and crates against the door leading up to the 3rd floor, as though that would have deterred any ghosts or goblins from coming down and bothering anyone.
In Seattle, Washington, they've got an entire underground tour you can take today where the underground was the above ground at one time. Downeyville's got an underground, Grass Valley's got an underground, and it sits underneath the Nevada Club and Williams Stationery, where the windows and the doors that had existed in the buildings when they were at ground level have all been bricked in.
My mom remembered as a little girl that Trezise brothers had, who were the proprietors before us, had toys in the basement. We have a full cemented basement in the store, but can't really use it because it's too dangerous if we have a bad winter. And paper products and water obviously don't mix, so we use it for a little bit of storage, but not too much. But back in the day, I guess they had some floods there and probably some damage to product and stuff.
There was a knowledge that when you were constantly wet, you were constantly sick. And if you were constantly dry, you weren't as sick.
In 1877, Aaron died of typhus, which was a very common death to the people working in the mines at that time. A lot of the men died of that. You know, once the disease got going in a camp, it just ran rampant. There was no way to stop it. And a lot of times the men were sitting in water up to their hips, and they were cold, and there was just no way to stop disease.
So somebody had figured out, this is before we had microbiologists and people that understood disease communications, and there was no CDC. Or this was just people being smart and saying, you know, we've got to get out of this wet. And so they did. They brought it up. There's a photograph of the downtown of Grass Valley on Main Street showing a whole bunch of miners out there picking up rocks and moving stuff around. And most of the captions under the pictures say, here's the miners picking up gold out of the rock, out of the roads. That was rock that was brought in. It was mine ore that they put in, and a lot of times the mine ore still carried gold. They weren't able to get it all out, and you could actually see visible gold in some pieces. But they loaded that area up from where currently is Auburn Street to Mill Street. That was known as a floodplain.
Downtown being known as the waterfront, and I don't know the actual origin, and I don't know if that goes back before my father's time or if they kind of started it, you know, in that era or not. But it was basically, you know, like you'd hear the waterfront in any town. It was, like I was saying, it was the lower end of town as far as geographically. So if we had heavy rains and stuff, we'd get a little localized flooding, and we always had flooding in our basement at the store if we had a normal winter. And there was also a few more, you know, bars and watering spots downtown that, you know, can be included in that too, as well as the, you know, in the early days too, the Housesville Repute. There were several in the neighborhood too. So it was kind of the waterfront, you know, and that's how.
Well, the term soiled doves is a very kind way of talking about the prostitutes in the Old West. Certainly you weren't able to say prostitute very often in any written publication, so you said soiled dove. Certainly when you think about that, you think about Miss Kitty on any of the Dodge City episodes, but it wasn't anything like that. I mean, it was a very difficult line of work. Women died at a very young age. A lot of the women that came west, and there were a lot of them in Nevada County, that came west with their fathers or their brothers or husbands, and their family died en route.
My grandmother found out that my grandfather had been or still was married to someone else. she was really kind of ahead of her time, actually, because she took off in the 20s, I think it was probably the late 20s, from Joplin to get away from him with those 3 children. I don't have any idea how she supported herself or those children. I just don't. And she started across America and wound up in Grass Valley. And just about the time that she arrived here and was settling down, Charlie Carter, her husband, found her. And my mother said we were packing to leave when we got the message that Charlie had taken a job in North Star Mine here, and they got the message that he had been killed in the mine. He was on an ore cart and stood up, and he was decapitated.
I want to share with you one of my favorite stories about the Nevada County area. And it was a teacher that came to this area who was a mail order bride by the name of Eleanor Berry. And Eleanor Berry advertised for a husband and received a response from a miner that lived in this area. And she came out and was very excited about meeting him for the first time after they courted through the mail for a long period of time. And so she was excited about coming out and meeting him. And she's on a stage, and she just gets into Nevada County. And she has her trousseau all packed up, and highway robbermen hold up the stage. And she pleads with them, please, please let me go through. I'm about to get married, and all of my belongings are here. My wedding dress, please let me go through. Finally, they acquiesce, and she gets to her future sister-in-law's home and changes her clothes. And she walks down the aisle, very excited about meeting her intended for the first time. And as they're exchanging vows, she thinks to herself, that gentleman's voice sounds very familiar. Where have I heard it before? And then she realizes, this is one of the men who robbed me as I was coming out here.
You know, they poured up in our little foundries. You know, each mine had a foundry, and they would pour it into the bullion bar, which was 1,000 ounces, about that long, and which, by the way, is just under 70 pounds. But they would pour those up, and in order to cut down on theft, if you just took that down to the post office and shipped it out, somebody could pick that up and run with it. So the mines always used to build a little box with either 2 or 3 sections in it, and you would put, say, 2 of those in there. Well, now you have 140 pounds, and you would screw a nice tight lid on it and put a metal band around it and take it to the post office and ship it off.
And Frank was born in 1851, started out being a miner, and then became a stagecoach driver. And at the age of 30, he was running the stage from Nevada City to North Bloomfield, and then that stage would go along the ridge, North San Juan Ridge, and end up in Smartsville. And when he left Nevada City, heading out North Bloomfield Road, he headed down towards Edwards Crossing. And the second switch back up from the bridge, Black Bart was hiding behind a rock and came out and robbed the stage.
I think one of Nevada County's most infamous criminals was a gentleman by the name of Black Bart. And Black Bart was a highway robberman. He would lie in wait for people, and he knew exactly the Wells Fargo route. He would wear sacks on his feet so it would cover up any of the tracks that he would leave. He was very smart about making the drivers believe that he had a team of people with him that were helping him to rob the stage. He would set up sticks to make it look like there were a lot of guns trained on a Wells Fargo stage. And really, it was just himself. And his gun was rarely, if ever, loaded.
Black Bart, my grandfather had told me,
that he lived at the Reeder Ranch. He did the books for the Reeder Sawmill. In later years, my grandfather, Sharkey, owned that sawmill there at the Reeder Ranch. But Black Bart was the bookkeeper and a gentleman, and they never realized that he was Black Bart. And they captured Black Bart, a detective, and went to jail. And the story is that after he got out of jail, they asked him if he was going to tell poetry or be a robber. He said, well, I can't do poetry because I said I'd never rob again.
If you can imagine, in 1849 and 1850, we still didn't have a court system here in Nevada County. We did have a system called the lynch system. The lynch system was trial by minors. Around February of 1851, a man was caught stealing $1,500 from his partner upriver near Downeyville. Well, they caught the individual, drug him back to Bridgeport, which is where they like to have their minor courts, tried him, found him guilty, and he was fortunate. He was only given 99 lashes. A few months later, in June of 1851, Yankee Jim happened to be up towards French Corral. He was accused of stealing horses and then making false bills of sale, selling them. He got caught. He was brought back to Bridgeport, and he was given a fair minor's trial, and he was promptly hung. An old story goes that he was hung not here at one of the trees because it was in front of a family residence. The wife said, no, you're not going to hang him here in front of my house. Go hang him on the bridge. We don't know how true that is, but if it was an earlier bridge built by Matthew Sparks in 1850.
In the late 1920s, the owner of this property, who was a farmer, Alfred Kneebone, decided to develop what he called the Bridgeport Swimming Resort. That consisted of a facility about a quarter of a mile upstream from here where there is a wonderful natural swimming hole. And he built 2 diving boards, a dining hall, a dance hall, and in order to accommodate his visitors, he built this gas station which opened in 1927 and was partially a store where he sold food and ice cream and drinks. Because he had power in this building at that time from a Kohler generator, diesel generator that was nearby, he ran 2 wires all the way up to the swimming resort and had lights for nighttime swimming. This bridge was completed by David Wood in the summer of 1862. We know that it was open for operation in September of 1862.
This ties into a route that started in Marysville, crossed this bridge, went on up to San Juan, today North San Juan, on up to Grizzly Fort, just above Oregon Creek, on past Plum Valley, on over the Hennis Pass, and then on up to the Diggins at the Comstock. The man that built this bridge and another friend, Thompson, they surveyed that route, and it rapidly became the busiest route in all this part of the Sierras. That was 1859, where over 100 wagons a day would come across this bridge and onto the Comstock Strike.
In 1960, when I moved here, there was no freeway, and there were great debates in both Grass Valley and Nevada City as to how to split the town or whether to split the town with the freeway. And this went on and created a lot of anger.
The freeway certainly changed things in the 60s when they started building that. Good, bad, or indifferent, extremely controversial. They didn't need a freeway going anywhere, but obviously town would not be like it is. I can remember it just seemed like torture to drive from Grass Valley to Nevada City because you'd be following logging trucks or slow traffic of one sort or another all the way, and it may take you 20 minutes to get from one town to the other, going around the curves and up the hills and waiting like that. So it's not necessarily a better era, but a bygone.
1961, 62, 63, the towns were devastated. Nevada City was almost a ghost town. People don't realize that. The lumber industry was failing. The mines, it cost them more to mine for the gold than the gold was worth. So they started building the freeway. Brought a lot of people in here. They cut the two towns, went right through the middle of them. And all the forefathers wanted them to go the outskirts of the town. If they would have done that, we wouldn't have what we have here today. So I'm all for the freeway going through Nevada City and Grass Valley.
Step back in time after I got home from Vietnam, I flew into the Reno airport and rented a car because my parents weren't quite sure when I was going to be out of the service. And so here I come down the road, everything, nothing much had changed. The Interstate 80 still had great big holes in it, and Highway 20 was crooked, and part of it's still gravel at that time. But when I came down Highway 20 right at Downville, I hit this new freeway section. It wasn't there when I left. I mean, I know they were working on it, but it had been completed. So I could see my mom and dad's house from the freeway. They took all the houses along, out in front of their place, I don't know, 5 or 6 for the freeway. And so I could see mom and dad's house, but I didn't know how to get to it. There was a sign that said Colfax turnoff, but I didn't want to go to Colfax. And so I parked the car on the freeway. There was nobody on the freeway. I mean, if there was 2 cars, I was amazed. Went up, hopped the fence, went to my mom and dad's house.
You know where Caroline's Coffee is now, the building adjacent to it across, I want to say Bank Street, was an old hospital. And I don't remember the name of the hospital. I think my wife was born there and later worked there as an intern. But anyway, the only doctor in town, he was the only one with a car back in the early part of the century. And his garage that I was identifying behind the post office and where the police department is, was where he garaged that car. And because it didn't go in reverse, he had a revolving floor that he'd pull in and then pull this thing around so he could pull out in a hurry. And I didn't believe that. I was saying, you gotta be kidding. And I'm getting this information from my father-in-law. And he says, no, it's still there. And I'll be darned if I can go down there the next day and look in the window and you could see that floor it's a wooden floor where he had to turn that thing around.
A big part of our life in those days was the Grass Valley Volunteer Fire Department also. And my dad was chief in 1950. And my mother's father was chief in 1915, and he didn't drive, but ordered the first motorized vehicle that Grass Valley had. In those days, it was a great honor to be a volunteer. There was a waiting list to be a volunteer fireman, and in my dad's later days, when he was unable to actually go out and fight fires still, he'd run down there. He would be there before the police would, and he'd direct traffic for the trucks to go through and stop traffic and everything. And
my grandmother was born again in Forest Springs in 1889, and when she first started teaching school, she would ride her horse from the Forest Springs, Allison Ranch area through what is now Alta Sierra. But she went to Chico Normal School, which is now Chico State, got her teaching credential, came back to Nevada County and actually got her high school diploma after she got her teaching credential. For some reason, the high school exam was only offered once a year, and she missed that because she couldn't get all the way from Forest Springs to Nevada City where it was offered, so she did things in reverse.
This was a wonderful place to come of age. There was always plenty of work and ways for you to pick up, spending money or Christmas money or whatever it was. And in the summertime, we had plenty of work to do, and nobody played because everybody had a job. Either worked for the Forest Service, building trails and as firefighters, or they went down and worked in the packing plants, which were down in Loomis or in Colfax or Marysville, where they had the fruit packing, mainly peaches down in Marysville, and pears and apples down in Loomis and everything. So people had jobs, including all the teachers. They were usually the supervisors in those places.
Before I was old enough to play softball over there, we were honored to go over and be a bat boy, for the teams that were playing, and listening to the Giants game on the radio at home, and you could hear Les Eva, who was the secretary and the voice of fast pitch softball from like 1936 on at Memorial Park. And so if we weren't over there, we had like a dual broadcast. We'd hear Russ Hodges and Lon Simmons with the Giants, and Willie Mays and Willie McCovey and all those players. And then they announced the softball games in those days, so you could actually follow the game from your house too.
Played junior varsity football at Grass Valley High. And then when I was a junior and senior, I played for the varsity. And then, of course, our great rival was here in Nevada City. They were the Hornets and we were the Miners. And we usually prevailed over Nevada City at that particular time.
Nothing better than those days. And then I went on to play and work in the summertime, either in the neighborhood. I had 5 or 6 lawn jobs, and I'd actually one day a week on Saturdays, usually go down to Hanson Brothers and work down at the gravel plant at the river.
Graduated in 1950, and I had been admitted to enroll in Stanford in September. And I planned to play freshman football, which I did. And at that time, we had a good family friend by the name of Truck Dillinger. That was his nickname, Truck. But he was an engineer out at the Empire Mine. And he had gone to Stanford and run track for Stanford. And he still was interested in the athletic program. And he said, come on up to the mine. I'll give you a job and we'll get you in shape for football starting in the fall. So the day after I had gotten graduated from high school, I went up and drew my hard hat and boots and all that sort of thing from there and bought that. And then on the following Monday, I reported to work as a mucker. I was being given a job as a mucker. The mucker is the guy who really shovels the ore into the ore car. In some places, you can stand up and you can do pretty well. Other places it was very tight, like where I was. But that is where most people start in a mine. Herbert Hoover, while he was a student at Stanford studying engineering, worked here in Nevada City as a mucker. My miner, as it turned out, was a fellow by the name of Norman Wasley, who was a very good Cornishman, been in World War II. And he kind of took me under his wing and lived up above us on Alta Street, so he would pick me up in the morning.
William Bourne inherited the Empire Mine from his dad, when his dad had kind of a tragic accident. But he brought George Starr up from the Bay Area. They lived in San Francisco. When George was 19, and actually William was only 24, but people were really grown up and in business when they were 24, 30, They could be millionaires by the time they're 30. But anyway, I tell the story that he brought his cousin up and introduced him to the superintendent of the mine, and George was given a tour of the mine. He thought he was taken down to the bottom of the mine, and the superintendent picked up a shovel and he said, "Here you go, Sonny." He says, "Put the broken ones in the cart." And George Starr was the mucker.
So my first day, we tapped in, and then we'd take off our street clothes. We would have 2 lockers. And on one side of a shower room, we had our street clothes, and we took off our street clothes. And then we'd walk across the shower naked, and then we would have another locker, and that's where we kept what the miners called their diggers. In my case, it was Levi's, and Levi, long johns, and you kept your boots there, and your hard hat, and lamp, carbide lamp, and that sort of thing. And you would put on your clothes that you were going to work in the mine on. And a few minutes, about 7 or 8 minutes before 7 o'clock, we would go up what they called the head frame. That went up 92 feet, and they would have all the man skips. This was the cars that they would have, and each one carried 11 miners. And you kind of sit cheek to jowl and put your lunch bucket in. And in our case, we were working at the 5,000 foot level. And that main shaft there at the Empire goes down to the 4,600 foot level. So they stopped at the 4,600 foot level. That's how much cable goes down. And then turned north and ran a long crosscut at 4,600 foot level. And then right underneath what we used to call the old post office, there's another hoist room, every bit as big as the one they have on the surface. It's just carved out of rock. That goes down to the 8,000 foot plus level. So we would go walk that point. We would get off at the 4,600, walk 3/4 of a mile, get on another car. We would have the hoistman with us, and he would lower us down another 400 feet.
We think of the guy down there setting dynamite in the walls and mucking out the shells and everything else, which is work we romanticize as historians. We think, oh, that looks like fun. It wasn't. It was gut-wrenching, horrible, horrible work. It was very dangerous. And my father-in-law did, in fact, die of lung disease as a result of working in the mines.
I watched the miner as he set up his machine, which was a drill, a pneumatic drill. And then he told me and showed me how I would to put the ore in the ore car. And it was, you couldn't stand up. I had to shovel on my knees. And I shoveled into this little Go Devil car. And the miner, he would start drilling his holes. And pretty soon he would be just in a fog because you had air and water going in. And so he was, I could see his carbide lamp, but he looked, I'm only 7 or 8 feet from him, but it was just almost like a fog. I could barely see this light, so the visibility was not that good. About 12, we would break for lunch, 30 minutes off for lunch. And then about 2 o'clock, I think, as I recall, the miner would have drilled perhaps 22, 24 holes, 4 feet in length. By that time, I was expected to have mucked out everything that had been blasted on the day before. And then the last thing we did would be the miner and myself. Once I got the hang of all this, you know, the first day was pretty green. I would help him fuse the mines. We had used non-electric caps on dynamite. And then he would fuse his sticks of dynamite. And then I had a long pole that I would push to keep the dynamite in there good and snug. And because they were non-electric caps, you couldn't hit it too hard because that was at the bottom. So he always said, now tap her light, son, tap her light. But he wanted them in there good and snug. But he always cautioned me, now tap her light. And then he would eventually cut all these fuses so that they would go off in a sequence. And then the last thing we did was take our carbide lamps and we would start lighting. We would go out down the drift and we'd listen to all the charges going off, and you'd hear the cap going through the rock go click, and you knew that was going off. Then you'd feel a little concussion from the wind. And then you counted them all, because if you didn't count them all, then you had to go back and relight the fuses. You had to wait 15 minutes. But Norman was a very experienced miner, and it never happened to us.
Yeah, there are interesting stories of all the things that happened around the mine, and it was, maybe some of them were horror stories of people getting blown up and things that I didn't relate. There was one about the guy that didn't light all the fuses for blasting. You know, all the fuses come out into a bundle, and they all go to dynamite charges, which is in the holes that were drilled the same day. Anyway, you're supposed to light all the fuses at one time and leave the area away from the blast. Well, the guy who was lighting fuses didn't light every fuse. There was one fuse half lit, and the fuses all blew up the charge, but the half lit fuse didn't blow up the charge that it's supposed to. And men went back down working with this half-lit fuse and the dynamite still in place. And you know what happened? And then people were working around there, boom, blew up.
So then we would start coming up, same way we did as we were going up. Night shift would be coming down. And we'd get up to the collar of the shaft, and we'd drop our lunch buckets right there at the collar. Norman showed me how to do that. We'd go back up to the into the dry, take off all of our diggers, which were now wet from perspiration and water dripping down and that sort of thing, and take a shower right in front of the shift boss. And then we go over to our, get our other locker room and put on our street clothes
go down and pick up our lunch buckets, which had been subject to inspection by that time. And that was the real purpose of the dry, was a passive way to prevent what they called high grading.
It's just a huge cavern, and it was held up by just one central pillar. And it's where everybody gathered for lunch and break and everything else. And it was almost one solid piece of gold, but they could not figure out how to remove it without the whole overhead caving in. So the guys would sit next to it, lean up against it, and then just kind of scratch the with their fingernail, put it in their lunchbox.
The story about you know, the Cornish miners singing. Well, why they sang and why they sang at the church doorsteps on Sunday was because high grade was being handled in the basement of the church, the Methodist church, and the miners singing allowed them to be able to break the gold up, the high grade gold, at that time.
And I was not involved in any of that rich ore, but there were miners who, you know, and they could really, in places, it would really be rich. They would take it out in powder boxes. And I've heard miners describe some of the veins, and the veins are not that big in the Empire or in the Grass Valley Mining District. They're only, you know, anywhere from 10 inches to about 2 feet or something like that. They're not that, but they're very rich. And there are some that are just like, you could take a gold paintbrush and run it across that it was just that, and then you would take that out in powder boxes and everything else. So it was a good experience for the summer, and I did get in shape, and I did play my first year at Stanford played football.
My dad and granddad came to the United States around 1905 and settled at the Empire Mine. Later, my mom came from San Francisco and was a mail-order bride. And she married my dad in about 1924. And later, they settled at the Empire Mine cabin below the Foot Mansion. And there were 7 kids in our family, and I'm next to the youngest.
They were not the mine owners. The mine owner was James Haig. He built a house later on up on the hill behind us here. But he again lived in San Francisco, much like most of the mine owners. So he was just back and forth a little. And part of the Foot's job was to entertain investors and young mining engineers and things like that. So the house was large because of the different aspects of their job. But yeah, he was the mine manager for the North Star mine. Now those 2 mines over the years, you know, they kind of went back and forth with ownership a little bit, but this was the North Star mine.
My father-in-law used to hijack rides on the narrow gauge from here out to Sibley's Pond, which was a famous place for everybody to picnic. The miners' picnics were all held out there. It's on 174, it's still there. And he and his friends as kids, and they're 6, 7 years old, would just jump on the train and get free rides out there, and the conductor would throw them off, say, you can't ride anymore, so he'd throw them off at Sibley's Pond, and then he'd let them jump on and then throw them off again when they got back to Grass Valley.
Everybody went to the picnic. They would go to all the businesses in towns, and the business would pledge to close their business and send their employees to the picnic. That's how important it was. Everybody went to the picnic on Miners' Picnic.
And of course, we think of the miners' picnics now as going on at the Empire Mine. Well, that was a working mine, so the picnics had to be taken out of town. And that's where most of them took place. And it's just it's fallen off the face of the history here. Hardly anybody knows about it. They know about Lake Olympia because, I don't know, we're sitting in the middle of it when we're at work.
Hi, I'm Jim Mowell, and I'm standing on the shores of Lake Olympia. Well, the former Lake Olympia. Until the late 1950s, this area used to be covered behind me here with a lake. When I was a kid, I swam in this lake, I caught bullfrogs at this end where the creek comes in, and we used to have pollywogs and other things we'd chase around at the other end. It was quite the place.
Actually, it started with my brother. We were living in Berkeley in 1949 and 50, and my brother was going to college at Cal, and he was in a fraternity with two guys named Pete and Pat Ingram. My brother used to tell my dad about Grass Valley because he'd come up here and visit the Ingrams. And so Dad came up and he looked around and he ended up buying Lake Olympia. It's a resort in Glenbrook.
And this pipe right here is about the only remaining structure that was there when I was a child. These pipes would go up out of the water and were part of a swing in which people would swing out over the water and drop into the deep water. I believe just to my right was a tower that had a 30-foot dive-off point. People would actually dive 30 feet off of that into Lake Olympia.
And they built a dancing platform in the middle of the lake, right on that island. So here you have a dancing platform with lights all around it, and it's all surrounded with water. You know, the big band era was over. And the days of bringing in bands and having big dances on the dance floor it just didn't pay anymore. You couldn't pay the bands to come up and do that. And you can't mix roller skating and dancing, because with dancing you need a slick floor. You know, we used to have to put out, it's like a soap, I don't recall what it was, but it would make the floor nice and slick. But the next time we would have roller skating, everybody was falling on their head. So we had to do one or the other, and we found that roller skating paid off a lot better than the dancing.
And there was a walkway going across to an island over here where these big trees are, big pine trees are over here on the island. And on that island was a building that had spring floors on it that was used for both roller skating and dancing, and a lot of other functions, parties and other things.
I've talked to many, mostly wives, who are so nostalgic about meeting their husband at Lake Olympia at the dance platform. And it just beautiful memories for a lot of people.
Well, my mom, as you had mentioned, in 1945, right at the end of the war, they had a tradition in those days for the 4th of July parade of having the Goddess of Liberty, they called it, and so different young ladies from the area were chosen, like not unlike a grand marshal, I guess, for the parade.
And his mom, Helen, was she was a beauty queen here. I mean, she was elected, and I saw pictures of her, and yo, she'll knock your socks off. She was a beautiful lady.
She was 25 years old, and she was the Goddess of Liberty in 1945, and so I was trying to think, I can't off the top of my head now think of some of the other women that I knew outside. I know Ken Holbrook's mother was too, and he said that his mother was the prettiest girl in Nevada City, and my mom was the prettiest girl in Grass Valley, and they knew each other. Of course, everybody knew each other in those days, and so.
In 1958, you didn't have the peace officer standard of training. You went in one day, and he took a badge, and he pinned it on your shirt, and you were a policeman. What struck me funny when I first went to work, some of the guys that were already there had been there for quite a number of years. And when something would happen, they wouldn't say a certain address like 240 South Auburn. Just say, it's down there next door to Mr. Smith's house. Well, of course, you just started, you don't know who Mrs. Smith is.
Everybody knew everybody. We never locked a door or window and in the house, you know, and very, very little, if any, crime rate really, you know, in those days. And so anyway, it was a good time to grow up.
And there was, of course, more respect for policemen at the time too. If there was a, let's say, a fight in a bar, You would walk in the door and blow your whistle, and the guys would quit fighting, you know, and get back up on the bar.
In like 1984, when we started our negotiations with Universal Studios to get Nevada County Engine 5 back to Nevada County, Lowell Robinson contacted Madeline Helling, who was then the president of the Historical Society, and said, if you get that engine, I'll go get it and bring it back for you. So, of course, obviously he didn't know what he was getting himself into, but because, you know, 30 years later, he was still hauling equipment for us.
You know, the kids went to school together and played together and went to church together.
Our class, when I graduated in 1950, numbered about 110, as I recall.
So growing up here was a lot of fun. When I was a kid, there was no freeway. There was nothing here. It was just a little town. Still had a Chinese section here in town when I was a kid.
When engine number 5 was purchased, about 1940, it was purchased by Review Studios, and they were making a black and white movie called The Spoilers. There was a lot of footage of the engine operating, and I hear stories like from Bob Payne how when The Spoilers was shown in Grass Valley, everybody went to the movies so they could see Engine 5. I don't know about John Wayne, but they wanted to see Engine 5 operating.
How about it, Kelly? All right to go. Only let me out of here. They're gonna pick you up with a soup spoon.